Well, everybody, welcome once again. This is the periodic table of history, and this is where we study history in 4 dimensions. We're going to look at the life of Jacob, and of course this gets us into the controversy of the entrance into Egypt. So let's dive into this. We can see the map here, and here is our primary area that we're going to be looking at. And then let's get into the periodic table of history. This is the time dimension. As we know from all of our other lectures, we have 6,000 years of history, and over here we have the equator where we have Ireland, Rome, Greece, Israel, Middle East with Assyria, Akkadia, India, China, and then we also have that same phenomena here with Egypt and the kingdom of Nubia or Kish over here. What we'll do is go back in time. We're going to go back in Israel's time from the present, about 2020, and then we're going to go to the past down here to the life of Jacob. So we're going to zoom in here. The flood is a good place where we can get our continuity. Here's Shem, Ham, and Japheth before the flood. Then we have the flood and Arphaxad, who was born after the flood, the first person in the New World. When we go through all the patriarchs, well, let's zoom up on the patriarchs, then we can see their life bars according to the Masoretic text. And then we get down here to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who are the popular patrons who are the originators of the nation of Israel. And of course, this is where we really get into the nation of Israel, because we're talking about Jacob right here. And I will give him a different color so we can see him a little better. There, see, now if we zoom out, we can see this orange life bar. That's his life bar with time as the y-axis. And then we can distinguish him a little bit better from the rest of these blue bars, which are also these Shemitic bars. They're corresponding to, on the map, the expansion of the Shemitic kingdoms over here. We remember in review the original 5 brothers: Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. And then Arphaxad had these generations that are going down to Jacob, who is the 22nd generation, moving into, well, the area of Canaan, which, according to the Book of Jubilees, east of the Mediterranean is for Shem. I don't know how far north that goes. And then Ham being here in Africa, and then Japheth being up here in Europe. And I'm not sure how far east that goes, because we know Asia is quite extensive. But as it stands, as it goes, right off the bat, we see the Shemitic kingdoms, or Semitic kingdoms, as the word has been corrupted to. And then we can see the backdrop of the Hamitic nations all here. And remember that Canaan was cursed here, so Canaan here is in, and his descendants are here in light blue, and then Canaan is right here. So those are corresponding to, if you look here at these generations of Shem going down to Jacob. A few stories that are of great significance are just that Jacob is here with Esau. They're twins. Esau comes out first, then Jacob. And so we have Jacob the deceiver, the one that's always trying to get his way. And when we look figuratively of who Esau is, he's a man of the world. And that ends up being interesting as far as learning about Jacob and Esau and their representations in the Bible. As far as the primary text, it's good to read Genesis 25. It's mainly Genesis 25 to 37-ish. And then you start seeing a lot more of the life of Joseph, but then Jacob and Joseph, their lives are intertwined, and that going into the entrance of Israel into Egypt. So the stories that we always hear about in synagogue or church are that of Jacob and Esau and the struggle between them. And it's the struggle between Jacob being a fleshly person trying to get the spiritual blessing, and Esau, who only cares about sensualities and money, more money to be greater and greater just for his own sake. So there's a big, huge struggle there that we learn about between Jacob and Esau. And if we go back to the map, it's kind of interesting to even see now where Jordan is. And I mean, when we look at the Shemitic nations, and then, well, I get Ham back on here as well. When we get all these guys together, look at the present day boundaries. You have the Ishmaelites from Abraham that are nomadic traders that go across this area and also into North Africa. As we see in one of the pseudo books, like Pseudo Jasher, that Ishmael did some warring over here in North Africa. We don't know if some of these books are real or not. Pseudo Jasher, there's a war between the Western world and the Eastern world that's like Europe and the Byzantine kingdoms of the East and Christianity, and so there's some differences there. So a lot of this stuff, just take it with a grain of salt. But you see Jordan right here, which is the land that Edom ended up settling. Let's see, I'll get some of these cities on here that are interesting as far as the life of Jacob. And remember that Esau was going south here to Seir. So his stomping ground is over here, which is actually near Petra, if you've ever seen pictures of that beautiful palace that's carved out of rock. It's down here in the area of Seir, not quite there, but this is kind of the vicinity. But if we look at Jordan, present-day Jordan is an extension of the Edomites and some of the Canaanites. So Esau, who later became the Edomites, married a Canaanite, but God explicitly told Abraham that he was going to give the land of Canaan to Abraham, and that creates a discontinuity for now Edom, or Esau, to marry a Canaanite. So now it makes them somewhat at odds with Israel. See, and we can see the struggle here anyway, but both of them are going to be great nations. It's interesting to see how Jordan pans out, because Esau marries, after he marries the two daughters of Heth, and Heth are the ones who are the originators of the Hittites that are up here in Turkey. But also, when Edom finds out that his parents aren't too happy about him marrying the Canaanites, then he marries one of the descendants of Ishmael. And Ishmael traveled across here, and you can see the shape of Iraq. Why is Iraq shaped like it is with its boundaries? Well, it goes all the way back to this struggle. And so Jacob and Esau are struggling. Here they are as the twins there. So there's nothing new under the sun. Jacob spent most of his time down here. We also hear about how Jacob is a deceiver, deceives Esau, and actually Isaac, his father. You have the whole family boundary issues there that everybody seems to have a problem with. And here we see the quintessential dysfunctional family. So Jacob ends up spending some of his life down here, and then he spends the other part of his life over here. And you can see why he got, he gets his wife Rachel and Leah from Paddan Aram, and also the other two, the handmaid wives, Bilhah and Ziplah. We can see Jacob with his children and wives here. Let me move that. He has 13 children. Twelve of them are male and one female. So all the blue, the kind of dark blue, are the descendants of Leah. So we have 4 here, and then 3, and then we have 2 sons from Bilhah, and we have 2 sons from Zilpah. And then Rachel has 2 sons as well. And Rachel is the pretty one that was also the idolater. It's really interesting that Jacob goes out here, gets all this wealth, wives, sons, daughters, wealth, and when he moves back, he drops it all off, and even Rachel dies as she bears Benjamin. So Jacob never gets back to his father's house with all those things of the world. So when you're thinking of it spiritually, it's kind of interesting to see that Jacob went out into the world, got all these worldly pleasures and things, and then when he came back, he lost them because he gave them to Esau. He gave some of these back to some of all these treasures back to Esau, and then Rachel dies. So interesting that we have all these works of the flesh, and then there is the spiritual blessing that Jacob was after, and he had to leave some of these things behind so he could get the spiritual blessing. So there's a lot of things, a lot of topics that we pull out of the life of Jacob and Esau, and I've always been fascinated with that. And half of Genesis is dedicated to, well, I would say, Jacob and Joseph. So that happens to be this time period right here. See, and here are the descendants of Esau. So he has different wives, and then the wives have sons, and so we see Amalek. But here the 12 tribes are very interesting: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Dinah is the daughter, Joseph, and Benjamin. And interestingly, Dinah is also being the daughter, has the interesting story about rape with Shechem. And actually Shechem is on the Amarna tablets. Yeah, Shechem is mentioned on the Amarna letters. So that happens to be real interesting because Shechem is written into the life of Dinah here. And maybe we can go in here and see where Shechem is. See, so if we back up and we start thinking about what actually happened, Jacob is here. He moves up, up, up. It's his wife. When he comes back, he has the problem. When he just about gets back to his father's house, he has these problems where the world is not too happy with him. So Galid is up here. Peniel, Dir Allah, Sukkoth. See, there's all these different names of these, and it depends on where you are in the windows of time, what the names are. Jabbok Brook is written in the King James Version, and we end up down here at Shechem. So after the Jabbok Brook, Jacob and Esau meet. Edom says, "I'll go to Seir," and then Jacob splits and goes over here to Shechem. Now Simeon and Levi came to Dinah's rescue here, and that's kind of noble of them, but you see how noble Levi is most of the time. And see, here's Simeon, here's Levi, so we're talking about the second and the third born. Now the book of Jasher, it goes into a lot of Hollywood hype. It starts marrying, it's almost like these guys are a bunch of superheroes that are just slaughtering everybody all the time. It's written very much Hollywood-wise, and so I caution against it as a primary text. It's just interesting in the sense of, it gives a different perspective of this time period. That's the book of Jasher, which is not known if it's a authentic book. It's just a pseudo book. But here Simeon and Levi come to Dinah's aid, and And you even see Jacob not too happy with what happened. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I mean, when you're reading the story, you're just like, whoa, rape is wrong. The sons were righteous and they did what they were supposed to. And then you see Jacob and you go, wow, I mean, you won't even go after these people for your daughter's sake. I mean, it baffles me. So there's a lot of character issues and things. When Jacob goes to the Jacob ladder and he gets sort of transformed, he comes out of that as Israel, and that's where Israel comes from. So we see, let's go back here. We say Jacob, his name is changed to Israel, and this is the first mention of that. And Jacob is starting to get the spiritual mind that God is in control, he is not, and he has to put his faith in God. But then when he offers sacrifices, then a fear falls on the Canaanites. That is something you always see when you study the Bible, is God's Spirit will go forth and God's will be done. It's just a matter of, will we be part of God's will? Now, Jacob's life is intertwined with the Joseph story, so now we enter into Egypt, which opens up a massive can of worms. The question that arises is, when did Israel get into Egypt? And if you're in the Masoretic text, where we're over here, the scriptures that are relevant are in Genesis 15, Exodus 12, Acts 7, and Galatians 3. And in the Masoretic text, we have this 400 years in Egypt. There was another story with Abraham entering Egypt. And there's another thought process that when Ishmael was persecuting Isaac, that may have started the 400 years of persecution in a land that's not their own. And that'd be the land of Canaan and the land of Egypt. And so the Septuagint puts Israel in Egypt for over 200 years, like 215, something like that years. I think Usher might say 217, but if you know that exactly, you can write that into the comments. But when we look at these scriptures, Genesis 15, Exodus 12, etc., we end up with this idea that the children of Israel are in Egypt for 400 years as slaves. And then they have the 30 years where they were not slaves. So the periodic table of history is based upon the Masoretic text, and there are other texts. That's why this is a big, huge can of worms. If we look at the Exodus according to Masoretic text dates, uncalibrated, these in the periodic table of history, get 1878 BC. Bishop Usher puts Israel, that is Jacob and his family, going into Israel in 1706 BC. That is a big deal and a big difference. And the reason it's a big deal is because we want to go in here and figure out when Jacob was really in Egypt. So there's three different scenarios here. One is we can wonder if Egypt's chronologies are right. One is, are the Masoretic texts right? And one is the Septuagint. Which one is correct? And I don't really have the answer to that. We can look at it directly and we can look at some hypotheses, and they're interesting. Now, as a scientist, I want things to be absolute. So that's something that I was really after with this project. And I realized that I'm never going to get that absolutism that I'm after. And I realized later that was okay. But for some people, I realized that might not be okay. But this is the interface where secular scholars and theologians have a mess of a time. And so if you have a son or daughter that you're sending to college, this is where they get them. Because what they do is they say the Egyptian chronology is absolute and infallible. And then because we have the Septuagint and we have the Masoretic text, then they say we can't rely on the Bible. Now, once they've established that, and they drill it into people from birth all the way through college years, well, then they whisk away the Bible completely, and they say, no, that didn't happen. Now, when you marry that to evolution in the academic world, you come up with a very powerful institution of knowledge, higher learning, that just kills people's faith. And so what I want to do is just look at this just a little bit. I'll go into the paradox of what's happening here. Here is Jacob. So you remember we have Jacob in the orange, and in his life he goes into Egypt, and it's toward the end of his life because he was there 17 years and then dies. So it's towards the end of the life he goes into Egypt, and then that 400 years, see, that covers something like that. If they're only in there 200 years, then history is shifted from the time they went into Egypt 200 years or 215 years. If the Septuagint dates are used, then we have also a discontinuity here, which affects us a little bit, and the discontinuity behind the flood that affects us a little bit. And what I mean by that is the dates show a different birth date for the children, and so that would do two events that shift history. Septuagint versus the Masoretic text, and it looks like this. There's merit both ways, and it's a thing for you to study, it's a thing for you to get into. It really goes on, and what my conclusion is, after having decades and decades of notes on this, is just that we can't know whether the discontinuity is towards the Masoretic text or whether it's towards the Septuagint. Most of this project would be the same. It's just that there'd be a shift here. Like, what I mean by that is we'd say, okay, the picture looks a little bit more like this, with a 7,000-year history rather than a 6,000-year history. And this is where everybody starts to get worried about this and saying, according to the Bible, the history goes 6,000 years, and some people say 7,000 years. And so then the lecturers will come out and they'll say, oh, in our system, we think the world is 6,000 or 7,000 years. It's because of this discontinuity. And so it's something that I don't know if we're going to get over. I just realized that we don't have the data. But that put aside, we get down here into Egypt, and if we pretended the Egyptian history is 100% accurate, then we can look for 1878 BC. And what happens here? Well, Sinisret 3. It's just a date. It means if the Masoretic text was absolutely right and those dates were calibrated and this was the Pharaoh, then maybe this is the region we're looking at. And there's not a lot of data here, and so that makes for a lot of agitation for everybody. If you go with Ussher's chronology, you're going to be looking at the year 1706 BC. That gets into this area. So we get into the 15th, 16th, and 17th dynasties. And the 15th dynasty is interesting because that's the Hyksos dynasty. So now you have a Semitic people group here in Egypt. The same time the Bible says there are Semitic people in Egypt. Now fortunately, the exit is the point where the Septuagint and the Masoretic text starts coming together. And so we have a lot more agreement there. And I'll say that my uncalibrated Masoretic text dates Israel leaves Egypt 1448 BC. But if you go to the Septuagint dates of Bishop Ussher, then we get 1491 BC as the exit date. And if you use the year of Jubilee, one method of calculation puts the date at 1446. So that's 1491 Septuagint, 1448 Masoretic, 1446 year of Jubilee, and then Thiel calculating the Jubilee, lots of assumptions, 1406. So you're right down here with Tutmos. Now that assumes that the Egyptian chronology is 100% accurate. You get into this, and it's just interesting to see that things are just about right. When you look at certain characters, like you look at this Tao-Tu the Brave, who his son is Ahmos. There's a weighty theory that thinks this Tao-Tu is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And then we also see this Semitic Hyksos people over here, which they play into a city called Avaris, which is Ramses. So when you look at a lot of this data, it's just sick that it's so close but not absolute. And so we can't get that absolutism that we want. See, here's Avaris, and here's some cities that are relevant for Egypt. But this would be a buffer zone so that any groups from Canaanite that want to attack Egypt end up attacking these Israelites first, or we could say Hyksos people first, or Shemitic people group first, instead of hitting Egypt. And Egypt could run after them with their army, see, because you have some natural barriers against attack, which is one of the reasons why Egypt is so powerful. This didn't used to be a desert. This was the breadbasket of the ancient world. So they could, in Egypt, they could take all the wealth of Africa, these other kingdoms that are developing, be the middleman trader that barters goods and service and give themselves an advantage on all fronts with the trade routes here throughout the Middle East, which also go all throughout the world. So this would be a great place to put somebody if you want them to be a pawn so that you can defend yourself. And there are archaeological, see, this puts them at 1554. See, it's not quite where we would like to see. And then Amos, which we could say Mose, which is different than Moses, but really similar. It puts him right there. Like if you put the Septuagint date in there, 1491, and now we're at 1525. See, it's almost there, but it's not quite there. What we can do is we can see the academics are looking for the Exodus here. When you look at the Septuagint calibrated dates, you end up here. Dates for the Exodus. We're right in here. Other thing to look at is there's an entrance that's disputed. Or I'll change the color of the entrance dates and then exit dates. So you can see where they vary and why this is such a disaster. Something I assume is that the Egyptian chronology might not be correct. Because this is a point where if the Egyptians got hit here, then a group of people could come in. This is a completely other theory, that another group of people could come in after Egypt loses their army, their slaves, they're in utter disarray with their firstborn killed, all those plagues of Egypt. Now you see all these question marks here. This is the 16th, 17th dynasty. Real interesting that it's all smashed up. Not known question marks everywhere. Dates not known, people not known. It's just a messed up period of time. And so one hypothesis is that the Israelites came out of Egypt, and then other Shemitic groups came down here. Like it could be the Assyrians or Assyrio-Proto-Canaanites, and they come down here and then clean the clock of Egypt after Israel is out of Egypt. And there is archaeological evidence of Shemitic people being in Egypt. The problem is the academics are looking here. They're looking in the wrong spot. And they have all these different textual examples of they should be looking in the Iron Age. They get confused on Ramses being Avaris, and to an intellect, they have to zoom right up into the details and then get lost. See, and I think this is something that they do a lot of times. But when you look in here, you start seeing more probability of this time period being the correct time period of the exit of Egypt, and then it's just a matter of, is Egypt's timeline correct? And I say we don't know everything. But as far as Jacob goes, we have one entrance that's over here at 1878 and one entrance that might be 1706 BC. And there we have Jacob spending the last part of his life in Egypt due to Joseph, who was in Egypt because he got sold as a slave. Now, I was really depressed over this, learning that there are discontinuities in different Bibles and different historical Bibles. And I was so depressed that I think God let me feel what it's like to be an atheist. I went to the lab that I work at like normal, and at the end of the day, I can remember writing back and thinking, does God exist? Are there errors in the Bible? Is God real? Is God faithful? And this depression was so great. And it lasted about 3 days. I didn't know whether God was real or not. And it was the worst feeling of my life. I felt depressed. I felt despair. My worldview had been rocked. I was questioning God, questioning life. And then I thought, wow, this is how atheists feel all the time. The only thing they have is this flat sense of nothingness, like the earth is just this ball of a rock that's flying through space with nobody in control. And that idea just depressed me. I was so down. I can remember thinking, what if I don't have guardian angels watching over me? What if God's Holy Spirit isn't in me? What if I'm living in a dream and living a lie? Because every bit of my life I want it to be reflecting truth. So I had a real problem. And then I realized that God really is faithful through thick and thin. And there was a time where there wasn't any Bible. There was a time where there wasn't even writing. And so when you think about the faith of Abraham and how he must have been, he lived his life and then he listened for God because he just believed. And then I can remember my childlike faith where I just believed in God. And instead of getting into all these details and questioning and saying that my intelligence is supreme, or science is supreme, or archaeology is supreme, or what we know right now is supreme, I started thinking about all the discontinuities in science, how they've changed the story all throughout time. Like they would say, there is no Goliath from Gath, there's no such thing as Gath. And then they'd find Gath. Or they'd say there's no Sodom, there's no city of Sodom, and then they'd find Sodom. But before that time that they found Sodom, they would say archaeology does not agree with the Bible. And what really happens is we don't have all the data yet. They say there's no such thing as Jericho, but then they found Jericho. So I started realizing that I cannot put learning or intelligence in front of God. And I can remember one time when I was really worried about the future and wondering whether I should quit my job or not. And what I did is I asked God, if I should quit my job, I'm going to toss these 3 coins, and if they all land on heads, then I'll quit my job. And so I tossed the 3 coins up, and they landed on heads, and I thought, okay, how about 5 coins, God? So tossed 5 coins up, they hit the ground, they were all heads. And then I said, I really didn't want to leave my job. So I said, how about 7 coins? I'll toss 7 coins up, and if they all hit the ground and land on heads, then I'll leave my job. And so all 7 of them, after I threw them up, hit the ground, they were all heads. Then later, I told my dad about that, and so I tossed 7 coins up again. And so that's 22 coins, and they all landed on heads, all in a row. That tells me there's a connection where God is actually interested in our lives. And sometimes he speaks to us, and sometimes he uses techniques like these to get through to us, things that are beyond probability. And so when somebody says, we're here because of evolution, because of randomness, I say, wait, God is the God that makes randomness order. and makes order life. God is above randomness. The God of life crushes the God of randomness or the God of luck. See, so that's one example from my life. Then another thing is, can God affect the weather? Well, I can remember at my mom's house, she cares a lot about her produce and works really hard trying to grow produce. Well, there have been multiple times when hailstorms come after everything has been growing for a while, and the hail just tear the whole garden up, tear the trees up, tear the fruit trees, leaves to bits, all the blooms, all that, and just destroy them. So we prayed many times, multiple times, for the hail not to hit our garden. And multiple times God answered that request. And later, I'm walking around the circle and the neighbor said, hey, how come when the hail comes and hits everyone's house except for yours? And I said, oh, well, that's easy because of God's faithfulness. We pray a lot. And that's praying with humility, fasting, seeking His face, and turning from our wicked ways. See, it's a fourfold automatic thing that's always being employed. You get knocked down, you get right back up no matter what. So I'll share with you a third story. I have a friend who got lung cancer, and this was quite tragic because he's the kind of guy that people can appreciate. He's always trying to help people out and solve problems and speak truth into people's lives. So I can remember being very down because of that, but I had seen multiple miracles in my life. And so in that instance, I started praying and fasting here and there, doing these one-day fasts. And then at one point in time, he said, his surgery is coming out. He's really worried. He's really worried because he's going to do a preliminary test in the following a couple weeks. And after that, they're going to do surgery on him. And it's big-time bad lung cancer. He was a smoker. And so that was coming up. And if God didn't intervene, then he was in big, bad trouble. So I can remember going, okay, this is it. I've got to fast and pray as much as I can. And so I did these 5 one-single-day fasts. And I prayed for him during those fasts. And at the end of those 5 single-day fasts, I remember it was a Saturday. And the next Monday, he was going to go in to do preliminary testing. And then I think it was the Friday after that, that when they concluded that he had cancer, they were going to chop a piece of his lung out. And he was super worried about that. So that Saturday, after the fast, I called him up and I asked, can I pray for you? And he was like, no, you can't pray for me. That's a last resort. No, stay away from me. And so when he hung up the phone, I thought, wow, here I've just done a lot of this prayer work. I said, okay, God, I've been rejected, but you're the God that takes care of people, even despite distance and everything. So I commit him into your hand. I plead with you to spare his life. It's up to you. And I could feel a spark happen. And I didn't know what that meant. Well, Monday, he called me up towards the end of the day and he said, hey, guess what? My test came back negative. The cancer is gone. So they don't have to do surgery on Friday. So he was absolutely ecstatic over that. And then I realized what that spark meant. It was God actually healed him. I was in my house. He was in his house far away. And he still got healed by God. That I think about God's faithfulness, it goes beyond our intellect and random numbers that we come up with, even timelines. Because of the miracle with the coin, the first miracle. Now that second miracle that I shared about the hail, God controls the hail. And then God controls our health. He is greater than our health. God is greater than numbers and timelines. He's greater than the weather and the earthly elements, and he's greater than our health. And he is the very one that creates life in us. Those scientists try to find life inside cells. They'll never find it with a microscope because God is spiritual. God puts his Holy Spirit and animates life. That's the thing they can never get to. I would never go into believing evolutionism. There is no hope there. The only hope that I find is in Jesus Christ, that he loves us, and that he forgives us, and that we can love the people around us, and we can make the world a better place. Now, Jesus had the parable of the sower that sowed seeds, and the seeds landed on 4 different types of ground. They were the fertile ground, the rocky, the thorny, and the bad. In 3 of these instances, the seeds sprung forth to life, but the seed that landed in the thorny ground, like that seed that went to the university, it got choked out. And the reason it got choked out is because people were looking at a timeline and they were saying, this is all there is. The only thing there is our intellect. And we look at all these details of all these dynasties and all these questions. God is greater than all these things. It's important for us to realize that, because if you don't realize that, you end up being like the seed that got sown into the world, and as soon as it hit the world and all the struggles and the vanity, never really grows fruit. It just kind of comes up and it looks like it's going to do something, and then it dies, and all the cares of the world take over. Jacob and Esau. Esau was a man of the world, and the cares of the world took him out. And Isaac got that spiritual blessing, and that spiritual blessing is to pass on hope and love to all the people of the world. So I really dreaded doing this video because of the discontinuity between the Masoretic and the Septuagint text. You can go on and on and on with all these things and let these cares of the world really take you down. Or in the end, what you can do is just put your faith in God and love the people around you, make this world a better place. And that's where I hope people will go with this. Well, I hope the best for everybody. I hope this helps some people to understand biblical history a little bit better and the problems facing the people that are going into the universities. Remember, it's always free to share, subscribe, comment, and thumbs up. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next video.